Dallas Willard was fond of saying that if Christianity is true, then we should be able to empirically observe the fruit of that truthfulness, that it should show up in people's lives in the way that they are transformed. And we should be able to observe it over the course of their lifetime and how they show up. Kind of like a seed being planted and watered, it's going to bear fruit as a result of its life that's in it. And so we should be able to scientifically study lives and see the fruit of God's truth bear out. But do we have any studies that actually do that? I would argue that we do, and that the results that come from it are really fascinating. This is the Neuroscience Informed Pastor Podcast. And that's our subject today. We're going to be taking a look at some research that sheds some really interesting light on people's life experience over the course of a lifetime. And it will be no surprise to you to find how consistent it is with the teachings of Scripture. But then what does that mean for us in terms of shaping how we think about discipleship and how we develop people's lives to be fruitful? We're going to dive
Just
into that.
what you spent your weekend looking at and nerding out about.
Yeah, I it takes a special person to nerd out about theology and neuroscience, but it's just so interesting to see God's design kind of play out. Can't
It
help it.
feels exciting. I remember when you were saying, uh, we've experienced it, like we know it through our interactions and intuitively because it's wired into us, but to see the research. So tell
Yeah,
us about that. Tell us about
yeah.
all the things.
Let's get into it. I'm Josh Spurlock, your host, joined here by Cassie Spurlock, and the Neuroscience Informed Pastor podcast is sponsored by MyCounselor.Online, a leader in faith-based mental health online. The study we're talking about is the Harvard Adult Human Development Study. It's the longest running study of human experience over a lifetime in existence. The study got started back in the 1930s. It's got thousands of participants, 83% of whom stayed with the study through their entire life. Most of them are dead now. And the study is into the second and third generation. They not only studied the participants, but began to study their spouses and children as they move through different periods of life, and really collecting data on what made for a life well lived. You know, what were what were the patterns in people's lives who were happy? That it's
Yeah,
fascinating,
it's totally fascinating. So, what did the study find? Don't leave us hanging.
right? Well, lots of different things, but the big takeaways in it will be no surprise to this audience or to you, that it's the things that the scriptures emphasize.
Mm.
Specifically, you're going to sum it up in one statement. Really, it's the quality of people's relationships that determine the quality of their life.
Imagine that.
Imagine that. And now that's not necessarily language that we put around it, but if we go back to the scriptures, what what did Jesus say was the most significant things?
Yeah. He was always emphasizing how our world revolved around each other and our interactions with each other and what that was like. All the teachings between us and the Father and us and each other.
All about relationship, right? Like the Trinity exists, God exists in relationship within himself. He created us in his image. He created us for relationship with him. Two greatest commandments: to have good relationship with God and to have good relationship with our neighbor, others. Like that's really what it comes down to. we call it like faith, friends, and finances, because there's this money piece in her also, right? And we're like, where does money fit into the picture?
Well, I mean, there are definitely significant things in the scriptures about that. Lots of teachings on money throughout the scriptures. So God obviously knew that that was an important piece.
For sure. And the findings of the research are, again, consistent with scripture. And it doesn't say that money doesn't matter, but money only contributes to our happiness to an extent. And to the extent that our basic needs are covered, that we have stability, and does it really contribute to our happiness? And after that, doesn't matter how much money you have, it doesn't make you more happy. And it's interesting, like you have lottery winners, right? People who win the lottery, they win it big, lots of money. 1 year after winning the lottery, they're at the same baseline of happiness that they were before they won the lottery.
That's wild.
Isn't that crazy? I mean, it's consistent with what we think, right? That money won't make you happy. None.
Or
But
at least what we say, but maybe there's a niggling thought that maybe, I mean, kind of, maybe contributes quite a bit.
yeah, now the research studies show that you know money contributes, household income contributes to happiness up to about $80,000 a year in annual household income. And then after that, it stops tracking with happiness. That is, money can go up, but happiness doesn't go up after that amount. But once folks kind of reach, 75 to 80,000 in the US is the average household income. And so once you reach about average when it comes to household income, it doesn't,
Yeah.
you're going to be as happy or unhappy as you know how to be at that dollar point. And no amount of more money is going to make you more happy.
And that was basically about having your basic needs met and not needing to, you know, fear that you weren't going to be able to cover food or your payments for things.
Yeah. So it's just the stability, that you can feed your children, that you have access to healthcare, that you have adequate housing, and that if you can't cover those basic needs, then the stress created from trying to figure out how you're going to cover your basic needs really robs from life.
Yeah,
But
makes
once you
sense.
have those things covered, happiness isn't improved by having more money, but it is improved by having more friends.
That's fun. We can do something about that.
Right? Right? That there's this idea, this fact in literature that loneliness has a greater impact on people than obesity. Right? We hear a lot about obesity in
Oh,
there,
for
but
sure.
loneliness has 2 times the negative effect on our health as does obesity.
Both mentally and physically?
Yes, physically speaking, like our life expectancy and our health, the Surgeon General um, issued a report last year on the effects of loneliness on our health, and the effect comes out to like smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day.
Oh, that's wild.
It's why,
Like, it's like, I feel like we almost need to take a moment of silence for how much our relationships impact our health, our
yeah,
thriving.
yes. Lonely people are in any given year 26% more likely to die
Gosh.
than people who aren't lonely. There's this incredible study of like 300,000 participants in the city. It's a massive study in like 15 nations of different hospital systems that are, you know, cooperating data. in this study, and they found that people with strong relationships were 50% more likely to survive anything, anything, all causes of death. They're looking at people who died and the likelihood of dying from cancer, from accidents, from all forms of death, anything that'll kill a person. People with strong relational ties,
Mm.
50% more likely to survive anything.
I'm like, that is what we're here on this podcast, why we're creating this podcast so that we can help people live.
Right? Right? I mean, when it was put to Jesus, what's really matters? Our relationship with the Father
Yeah.
and our relationships with one another.
Yep. That hope, that comfort
Mhm.
that comes from those things.
Yes, so much. So, that being true, that being both true because scripture says it's true and being validated in the scientific literature and the study of human beings, and there's some, I think, real implications for our discipleship process. And
Mm,
so much of our focus in discipleship is focused on kind of left brain teaching information about the scriptures, like all discipleship processes for to communicate, that loving God and loving others is important to the scriptures.
right.
Fantastic. But how do you do that? What does that mean? What does that look like? I think one
Yeah.
of the things I love about this research is it really operationalizes and looks at what does it mean to have high quality relationships? What makes relationships high quality? What
Yeah.
does love in action look like? Loving your neighbor look like in the real world, kind of outside
Yeah.
the classroom?
Like finding the answers to those questions and putting them into practice in light of these things feels so important and valuable.
Hugely so. And like teaching people how to have those kinds of relationships like that, I think it needs to be a significant part of our discipleship focus. Like, how do we help move it from the page of scripture and from the sanctuary on Sunday morning to Monday through Friday? And
Yeah.
it's about cultivating friendships, right? Loving your neighbor is about cultivating friendships. And we need friendships of different kinds. We need different things. Not no one person is able to fulfill all of our friendship needs.
Yep.
And just the sheer volume connection. Addition research studies show that people who are the happiest in life, this was a little mind-boggling to me.
Was it intimidating? I think old Josh, who hadn't really experienced this for yourself, would have been really intimidated by this number and also would have maybe deflected a little bit, been like, that might be true for some people, but it's not true for me. Not to call you out or anything.
That's true. It's
No,
true.
it is.
And I reserve the right to get smarter. And I reserve the right to keep growing and maturing as a human being. And I'm definitely happier today than I was at a different season of my life where I didn't understand relationship and have relationships the way that
Yes.
I do and didn't put the proper emphasis on it. But there's no substitute for time. I had a
Mm,
pastor once that said, show me your calendar and show me your pocketbook, and I'll tell you what your priorities are. And we can often say certain things are important. We cognitively assent that they're important. But what
yeah.
do our investments of time and money show are actually important to us. When it comes to relationships, loving your neighbor, developing friendships, and there's no substitute for time.
Yeah.
And the idea of quality over quantity, not a real thing. You need both.
Oh,
You need
oh,
quality and you need
oh.
quantity.
You can't just like sticks an hour on the calendar and be like, for the next hour, we tell each other our deepest, darkest secrets. And that
I mean, you
get
can do
the
that
job
too, but
done?
not enough people are doing that. Right? In those relationships where you have kind of that
Mm,
emotional closeness and confiding, which is one of the variables or domains within kind of qualitative measures for relationship, emotional closeness and confiding. But actually, quantity is even of higher importance than quality. Interesting enough
yeah,
that we
fascinating.
need like a spectrum. But anyways, back to this number, right? That the happiest people spend 6 to 9 hours a day, 6 to 9 hours a day socializing, interacting, having human contact with other humans.
Like from saying hi to the cashier in the
Mhm.
grocery store line, all the way to intimate conversations with a friend or family
Yes.
member.
Yes. In the literature, I talk about weak ties and strong ties
Hmm.
in relationships. I kind of broadly categorize relationships into strong ties and weak ties. And so your weak ties are going to be your people that you see at a grocery store, maybe the clerk that you see regularly, or on Sunday morning the greeter at the door, and you kind of know their name and you know that you go to church with them
Yeah.
and you're friendly with them, smile,
Yeah.
wave. But it's not a strong tie relationship. It's just somebody that you see and have some level of connection interaction with, or even strangers, you're sitting next to them on the plane or the bus. There's an interesting study of folks on their commute, because all of us tend to generally, with few exceptions, some of the folks out there are the chatty Cathys that they can talk to a fence post, and talk them up for sure. But the majority of folks, and I think I'd rather just keep to myself on the commuter train rather than strike up conversation with the stranger next to me. But that uh, what we call affective forecasting, right, is what I think will make me happy, what I think I'll feel. It turns out to actually not be very accurate. That one study, assessed folks or whether or not they wanted to interact with folks on the train versus not interacting with folks on the train. And that, and then they, you know, had them intentionally
Do it. Yeah.
engage in conversation and then measure and found that it actually made folks happier to get out of their comfort zone and engage in the human
Mm,
contact, even with strangers on a train, than to not have that human contact.
yep. Doesn't surprise me how many things in life are like that we poorly predict for ourselves.
Yep. Yep. So when we think about this, like 6 to 9 hours of contact and interacting a day, it doesn't have to be like 6 hours of one kind of contact or what we
Yeah.
may think of as hanging out with friends or whatnot, that it's all the different connections and interactions that we have with people throughout the day. And so our interactions with folks, our coworkers, has the potential to be a big part of that. And the higher the quality of the relationships with our coworkers that we have a
Mm.
higher amount of contact with throughout the day, the happier we are. And
Well, let me ask you a question. How does this apply to the introvert extrovert
Mhm.
conversation?
Yep, they ask that question, and it actually applies universally. Then that this is true just of humans, whether you're extroverted or rather introverted in nature, that the contact that you have with folks and the our need for human contact doesn't decrease. Now, the
That's
nature of that
wild.
contact may be different,
Yeah.
right? You know, you're the kind of contact that feels good to you versus what doesn't varies person to person. What's energizing versus what's draining and depleting for you. But our need,
Although it makes me think back to that challenging to predict. And I would just say sometimes it's good to get out of our shell in that space and, try something new.
yeah, it's, we have a very individualistic culture here in the US,
Mm,
and we're kind of really designed culturally to be very isolated.
yeah.
That we can get up, get in our car in our garage, pull out of our car, drive to work in our cubicle, work in our office, work in a space, have very limited contact with other humans, get back in our vehicle, drive back home, pull in our garage, close the door, and be lonely as we compare ourselves on social media or watch TV shows about friends.
Mm.
You know,
Oh, that's brutal.
Culturally, we set it up that way.
Yeah.
For most of the world, most of the time, that hasn't even been an option. You've had to interact
Yeah.
with more people day to day just for survival's sake,
Yeah.
engagement. And we're not
Uh,
here for it.
yeah. Which, yeah, makes me think like, what is one step I could take today to move towards more intimacy with the people in my life? Or
Yeah.
do I need to create new options for intimacy for
Mm,
friendships?
yeah. 3 out of 4 folks in the US report feeling lonely. That's huge. That's inside and outside the church. That's not differentiated. We've got lots of folks that attend church and they don't make meaningful connections with the people there, and they don't have friends. And and they're not maturing spiritually because you can't mature spiritually outside the context of relationship. You can learn more.
Oh, whoa, 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 whoa. How can we not mature spiritually? This feels like a totally another can of worms. That is a bold statement.
It's true. There is no discipleship outside of kind of a yourself, God, and one other person. And discipleship's
Mm,
impossible. It,
mm,
it requires relationship. And we mistake information for maturity.
yeah.
Like information alone just puffs up.
Mm,
It's the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes are, the glowing examples of that in scripture. They knew very much about scripture. They knew very much about God, and the information wasn't transformational for them. They didn't become more mature. They didn't become more like God. They didn't love
mm,
better because of what they knew. And yet we have a very
yeah.
left brain discipleship paradigm within our church today
Yeah.
where it's about downloading information, which is valuable, right?
Totally.
Undergrad in biblical languages. I love studying the scriptures. I think I nerd out about theology.
Yes.
The information is great, but it doesn't transform. And it certainly doesn't make us happy. And
Mm,
it's the relationships that we cultivate and that we lean into vulnerably that create transformation and actually make us happy.
yeah. I think a important word that you said there, vulnerably.
Mm-hmm. Back to the quality of relationships, right? And how we show up. So I think there's a lot to mine here, and I'm sure we'll be talking about this research in a lot of future episodes in this because there's just a lot to unpack here. But the implications for how we focus our efforts in discipleship in the local church is huge. Right? Like the way Jesus wired us is to be happy in the context of relationship, which is why he makes it so significant how we treat one another, and the quality of our relationships matter significantly. And so digging into what does it mean to love our neighbor and to be in a
Yeah.
loving relationship with one another, and all the one another passages that are in scripture, like how do we live those out, and getting super practical of cultivating that in folks, not just teaching them to quote the verses, but to teaching them how to live it out. It's where it's at. It's the challenge before us.
Yeah. It's paradigm shifting. Like,
Mhm.
like we had an inkling, I think, of how important this was, but this is just a really great reminder and then an additional layer unveiled that
Mhm.
I don't know. It puts a fire under my behind to like get some stuff done in engaging people.
Yeah, it gets me thinking also, right? So much, I think, of the scriptures talk about the relationship piece and can quote the verses, but yeah, is the knowledge of those verses actually translating into how I show up? And do I know how to
Yeah.
translate the verse into daily habits and practices of my life and how I engage my world? Like, that's the discipleship bridge
Yeah.
that has to begin. It's not just memorizing the verses, it's knowing how and having it demonstrated for us how to live that out in a way that actually bears fruit, as
And I
Dallas
think
said.
for
Well,
our
go ahead.
I think for our pastors, I just want to give a loving maybe challenge or question, like how well are you doing this in your own life?
Mm,
Like starts with the leader. Like if you haven't experienced it, if you don't know what it is, you can't really give it. You can't really share about it. You can't really go first. Follow me as I follow Christ.
mm. Truth bomb right there. There's some interesting study on pastors data out there that would say over half of pastors are lonely.
Mm. Of course. It's such a
Mhm.
hard job and you spend so much time pouring yourself out to others, but that's one kind of relationship, but it's not exactly the kind that feeds you and fills you and helps you thrive. Like
Not the only kind you need.
you have to have relationships that you're vulnerable in.
Mhm. And that are life-giving for you.
Yes. Joyful and
Mhm.
fun and
Mhm.
lighthearted and playful.
You can't
That's as legitimate as the work you do to serve the body.
Yes, you can't lead where you haven't been willing to go yourself. And discipleship happens through example in relationship. It's mentorship, not informational transfer. It's got to be lived out. It's got to show the way. It's challenging for me, and being intentional about my social fitness. This is kind of the new term emerging from the literature, to
It's good.
recognize that developing relationships takes work, just like muscles or maintaining our body health, our relational health requires intentionality. So, in being intentional about our social fitness.
Yeah.
Man, we're out of time in this episode. Lots more to unpack. I'm excited to continue the conversation with you, Pastor, and with you, Cassie, around how we can use the neuroscience and the biblical wisdom to shape our own maturation process, discipleship journey, as well as how we lead others in their discipleship journey. This is the Neuroscience Informed Pastor podcast you've been listening to. It's a continuing education podcast for pastors, applying the neuroscience and biblical wisdom to discipleship and how we disciple ourselves, our family, those we have responsibility for. Sponsored by MyCounselor.Online, leading provider of faith-based mental health online. If you need counseling, if family needs counseling, if people on your staff need counseling, if those that you care for need counseling, the counselors at MyCounselor.Online would be honored to care for you, your family, and those you serve. Thanks for hanging out with us and being a part of this community. There's something that you've heard here that's been useful to you. Would encourage you to share it with somebody else that might benefit from that. And we'll see you back here for more cool nerding out around neuroscience and theology here soon.